Hi, I'm Alistair, the grumpy CIO. And what am I grumpy about this week? Well, actually, I'm not grumpy, I'm more kind of frustrated because there's all this call that we need to reimagine our businesses in the face of AI and reimagine our society in the face of AI. There's very little actual framework in what we should actually do for that. And particularly as a small business owner, I don't have the advantage of having the State Department to do the thinking for me. So here's a framework that arrived very much inspired by classical physics that I studied at university about how we can think about the operators, use cases within our business, and also approach it as a fresh sheet of paper. Credits where credit's due. This comes from a man called Jeffrey Booker, who wrote this wonderful book here, Essays in Physics. You can see on the screen. I'm not being paid to promote this at all. But Modern Classical Optics, I seem to remember reading going, that's most of the lecture notes he gave us going through. I owe this man an incredible debt of gratitude. I know there's so many people out there who owe people who taught them debts of gratitude as well. Shout out to Dr. Sukumar too. But physics at the end of the 19th century, as taught to me by Dr. Brooker, was actually, I'll use the word smug, it wasn't his word, but I'm going to go for it, because things have been discovered by Newton and then by Maxwell and other places, and they were in quite a good state. We thought, basically everything on here was kind of filling in the gaps, dotting the I's, crossing the T's, and making sure that physics just worked. Then suddenly come two different things. One is called relativity and the other one's called quantum mechanics, and they completely overturned quantum, the energy only arrived in quanta, which led to quantum mechanics. And they overturned everything. And they had to go and rethink what it meant, that these laws that they previously thought were fundamental, just how things worked, weren't. And I think that's where we are, where there's a state where business just works the way it does, and we have always assumed it. There's always a certain thing where a finance department has a certain number of people because they do certain functions, and we will be rethinking those things. So things like what we need to do is go, what's the AI equivalent of assigning an account code to an invoice? What's the AI equivalent of assessing a gum retreat if you're a dentist, or of tracking your livestock if you're in mass agriculture, or use case 4, use case 5, etc. Where this came from out in physics as well is they had to look at how to calculate momentum and what it actually meant in a relativistic world. And they end up with, if you remember from your school, momentum, linear momentum, is mass times velocity. You may remember that from your little school. You're feeling smug about yourself now. Well, actually, in reality, it's gamma mass times velocity. Gamma is a function of your velocity in your reference frame, your inertial reference frame. And it's 1 over the square root of 1 minus v squared over c squared, which is in most cases just 1, so it doesn't make any difference. Why does that make a difference? It's also looking at something going, they looked at all this stuff and went, for all reasonable use cases, this is an incredible thing, but momentum is just calculated exactly the same way in any real example. Similarly, Newton's second law, you might remember that one, force equals mass times acceleration. Well, actually, force equals mass times acceleration kind of when you're in your normal frame of reference, you're just looking around. When you're outside of that, it actually does completely different things. And what they discovered, if you go and look at things like quantum electrodynamics, which is where we end up later, is that the actual fundamental reality of how things interact with on force on each other was completely different. And the laws that we thought were fundamental for Newton and were just how things worked were actually a derivation of some underlying truths or assumptions or axioms that then changed. Now that's the same for business, I think, is that there's a bunch of things that we assume are working. A lot of the stuff will just stay the same, but some things will actually have to sort of go, well, actually doesn't work anymore in certain extreme cases, or because AI will simply just break down the underlying axiom or underlying functions of how it works. We'll end up actually just doing completely different things. So what you could also do is come in with a fresh, clean sheet of paper. So at the beginning of quantum electrodynamics, there's a guy called Richard Feynman, read his autobiography because I'm a nerd, and he wrote these things called Feynman diagrams. If you ever studied physics, you'll recognize that's a Feynman diagram. And what he did, there was a guy called Julian Schwinger, quite famously, was producing pages and pages of voluminous equations about how everything might work. And Feynman just kind of threw everything away and just went, well, what happens if you just represent the world this way? You don't need all that stuff. Just think about it differently. You've simplified your world and this just works. He was roundly laughed at initially by serious and senior physicists for doing this, but it came up. And what he was quite famous for in his life was disregarding everything that wasn't important, just going, come up with a fresh sheet of paper and what happens if. And the most famous example of this was in the shuttle disaster of 1985, where he was the person, you actually remember, who actually put a piece of the putty that had frozen due to temperatures in a block of ice, pulled it out and smashed it and said, I really think we should be looking at this, and did it in front of live cameras in front of a Senate committee as well. So that's about coming up with a fresh sheet of paper. You come up with these two different things, you put them together, you will actually come up with how AI will affect your business. And it doesn't always have to be bad news. A guy called James Maxwell, if you're in London and you're walking down Holborn towards the Strand, you pass the King's College, part of the King's College campus, and there's a big picture of him on the wall. And he wrote some famous things called Maxwell's equations that explained electromagnetism. They were written, again, in the 19th century. He published his paper in 1860, final version, in 1865. And then when it went through the 20th century, they actually discovered that they actually just work. Even in quantum theory, in any perceivable way, quantum electrodynamics only actually makes a difference if you're in really extreme conditions, like you're smashing an atom, or something's very, very far away, or very, very small, etc. These are the conditions that cosmological differences or tiny quanta differences. Everything else, Maxwell's equations just work, and in relativity, they just work full stop. So, special relativity. So your ideas will survive AI. Some of them will be changed. You'll have different operators. You'll have some bits where you just come up with a simple sheet of paper. But your ideas will survive AI. You just have to start off with a list at the top going, what are all the use cases, go down, and where it gets funny and funky, put that one aside, and come in separately going, reimagine my business as if we were just starting with just start from scratch. Put those two things together, write it all down, you'll come up with a picture. Thanks for watching. I am Alistair, the grumpy CIO of www.shipshape.vc. Come to us to optimize your investor outreach. We are the free venture capital search engine. Thanks for watching.